I want to invite you to take a journey with me. Now, as we take this journey, we're going to use three sources for this journey to a village that would have existed in Palestine in the first century during the time of Jesus' life here on this earth. And again, we use three sources. Number one, we'll use the Bible. Number two, we'll use some archaeological information. And then finally, life in Arab villages today. Historians and archaeologists alike say that even though it's been 2,000 years, that very little has actually changed in that part of the world as it relates to village life. The biggest change, of course, is that 2,000 years ago, the villages were Jewish, and today they're Arab. And there have been other changes as well, but for the most part, the Arab villages of today are very much like the villages that would have existed 2,000 years ago. Housing is one area that hasn't changed much. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of a neighborhood in one of these villages. Most of the poorer houses had one room and they were 10 feet square. So that's not very big, okay? But that's poorer houses. More wealthy houses may have 2 rooms in them. Regardless, they were lit by a single window and the door that stayed open most all of the day so that light could get in to the inside of the house. These housing units were very close together, as you can tell from this picture. Sometimes there would be 4 sort of joined together with a common courtyard in the middle of a courtyard of sorts in the middle for their use. They were very, very dependent upon each other for even the barest of daily essentials. One thing that is different today than it was back in the first century is bread. When I say the word bread, what do you think of? Most of us think of something like this. A nice, soft loaf of bread, sandwiches, toast. We think of something that's very soft and neatly sliced individual pieces of soft baked dough. Bread in first century Palestine, though, was more like a tortilla today. Only it was bigger than most tortillas are and harder than tortillas. Thus the saying break bread, because they would literally break it in half and then in half maybe again in order to eat it and to use it. And bread was not available at the local market either. It had to be made by hand each day. Each day the women would wake up, they would start by using a millstone to grind the grain, and then they would take it to a community oven that might look something like this, where they would take their turn to put it into the oven, and when it was done they would pull it out of the oven. Since bread was used at every meal, much like we would use a fork or a spoon, you had to make sure that you made enough each morning for that day. Because there came a time in the day, in the morning, when the oven was put out. And when the oven was put out, they weren't going to be making any more bread until the next day. And if you didn't have enough bread, you were just out of luck. Bread was a staple of the diet. More is said about bread in the New Testament and in the Bible than any other food. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus prays, "Give us today our daily bread." And as we talk about that being the very basic of necessities, and bread was just that. It was the basic of necessities. And so we see how important bread was. In fact, bread was so important that if you didn't have bread, you didn't eat. It was that simple. Well, let's say that late one night, your great Uncle Bob shows up. Not totally foreign, because in the first century, they didn't have air-conditioned vehicles that they traveled in. And so they would travel at night because it was cooler on their feet. The roads were cooler. It was easier travel conditions. And so this isn't totally out of the question or totally unreasonable to assume. But Bob shows up at midnight, though. Now, when he does, what do you, the host, do? Me? If it were me, I would say, glad you made it. I'll see you at breakfast. But problem is, in the first century, no matter when your company arrived, you served them a meal. This was a way of honoring their arrival to you and honoring them as guests and welcoming them to your home. So Bob gets in at midnight, go in and start to prepare a meal, and you discover, I don't have any bread. What are you going to do? You couldn't admit that you didn't have any bread or that you were out of bread, because to do so would be a disgrace to you and it would be an insult to Bob. So what would happen, since there wasn't a 24-hour bakery nearby, what would happen is that the one member of the family would slip out of the house and go to one of their neighbors and ask to borrow some bread. Now, and you always had to have more than enough. Okay, generally speaking, if you needed 1.5 to 2 loaves of bread per person, per meal. And so if you have one guest and you're going to serve them a meal, you would need 3 at least loaves of bread to set before them. Because the more that they had left over afterwards, the higher the honor was to the guest. That's why I said in that society they were so dependent upon each other. Because of that interdependency, your honor and standing in the community was something that was very, very important. It was not something that you wanted to mess with. It was not something that you wanted to damage in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Never did you want to bring dishonor or shame on yourself, your family, or your community. Honor was and still is very important in that part of the world. Several years ago, there was a young girl who was shot by her brother as she was coming out of a medical clinic because her family suspected that she had been engaged in an immoral relationship. And so rather than having her, who maybe not, maybe was, maybe wasn't, involved in an immoral relationship, her brother shot her. Tragic. It's sad, but it shows the importance of family honor. In that time, if a family had a guest, that guest wasn't just a guest of that family. They were actually a guest of the entire village. So everyone in the village would want to see that a guest was treated properly, was taken care of, was welcomed appropriately. And so that's why you could go to somebody at midnight and ask for some loaves of bread because a guest had come. A personal honor, village honor depended on them to help. Greet a guest properly. There is a story that is still told among Arab people today. There was a scorpion that came to a wide river. Of course, the scorpion knew he couldn't cross the river, but he needed to get across the river. And so there happened to be a frog hopping along on that side of the bank, and the scorpion stopped him and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Frog, could you give me a lift across the river?" And the frog said, "What do you think I am, nuts? If I let you get on my back and I swim across the river, you're going to sting me." The scorpion said, "Oh no, I promise, I'm not gonna do that. I would never do that to you." Well, the frog thought about it and he said, "Well, if you promise, get on my back." And so the scorpion climbed on the frog's back and they started out across the river, and sure enough, about halfway across the river, the scorpion stung the frog right on the back of the neck. The frog said, "That was silly. Now both of us are going to die." The scorpion said, "Well, I had to because my honor was at stake." Doesn't do a lot for us today, does it? But that shows just how far removed from this culture we really are. In this culture, honor was more important even than life. Now, I've given all this background information to help us understand our scripture for today, taken from Luke chapter 11, if you want to open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 11. In our first lesson on prayer's powerful potential, we saw how prayer interacts with God and allows us to come into contact with the power of God. Today, I want us to see that prayer has powerful potential because it has to do with the character of God. If you would follow along as I read Luke chapter 11, verse 1. One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples." Now what follows is what we commonly refer to as the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to be looking at the Lord's Prayer later on in this series. But I wanted to start by reading that first verse to show you that even what follows the Lord's Prayer, Jesus is still teaching his disciples about praying. And so let's pick up in verse 5. Then Jesus said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and he goes to him at midnight and says, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, because a friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have nothing to set before him.' Then the one on the inside answers, 'Don't bother me. The door is already locked, and my children are in bed with me. I can't get up and give you anything.' I tell you, though he will not get up and give him the bread because he is his friend, yet because of the man's boldness, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. So I say to you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks, the door will be opened." Jesus takes a story straight out of village culture to make an eternally important point about prayer. And he uses bread because bread was so common and so popular in that culture. And this is something that could really, truly happen. So why, though, is the bread given? Why does the one on the inside trouble himself to get up and get the bread for the person? Well, bread is given because honor is at stake, or because character is at stake. Bottom line, bread is given because it was the proper thing to do. It was the proper thing to do because so much of that culture relied on honor and character of the individual person. See, if the neighbor did not do it, did not get up and give the person some bread, it would cause him disgrace. If the neighbor did not do it, it would cause the host to be disgraced. If the neighbor did not do it, it would cause the village, the entire populace to be disgraced. To not give bread would be a disgrace. And so bread is given because honor or character is at stake. How does that relate to prayer? Prayer is powerful, or at least prayer has powerful potential because it has everything to do with the character and honor of God. If we were to ask, and God ignored us, or just didn't listen to us, refused to listen to us, if God ignored us, that would be disgraceful for God. Why? Why would that be disgraceful for God? A preacher, how can you say that would be disgraceful for God? I say it because of what Jesus says, or God says in verse 9. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. If you pray, God has said that He will listen. That is God's promise to you. Anything less than listening and answering would be a disgrace to God. Now, before I move on, I need to clarify something here. And tell you what this does not mean. This does not mean that God has given us a blank check and every time we want something we write in the amount and we give it to God and He gives us everything we want just like that. It doesn't mean that God has guaranteed that He is always going to say yes. No matter what we ask for, God is going to do it. It doesn't mean that, okay? We'll deal with quote-unquote unanswered prayer later on in this series of lessons. For now, let's just suffice to say that there's really no such thing as unanswered prayer, and I'll show that to you a little bit later. My point is that God always listens and God always responds in some way. Now, what happens if the neighbor doesn't have any bread, or he only has one loaf of bread left over from the day? Well, what would happen is that neighbor would take that one loaf if he had it, or if he didn't, he would give that one loaf to the person who needed it, and then he would go around the village as well looking for someone with bread so that this guest could be taken care of. Again, it was a question of honor. Bread is given because honor is at stake. In the parable, God is the one on the inside. We come to Him and we ask, and God delivers. Because it's a matter of character. Not our character, it's a matter of God's character. Bread is given because the honor or character is at stake. Bread is also given, though, because of boldness. Now, that's a little curious in verse 8, that word boldness. If you have a different translation, some may have importunity or persistence. In fact, the NIV has a footnote where it says, or persistence, in the footnote for this word boldness. It gives the impression and the idea that this person that doesn't have bread and has a friend come to him goes around knocking and knocking, and they keep knocking until he finally gets the bread, until he drives the person on the inside nuts. And so the one gets up and gives him what he wants. But can I ask you a question? I mean, just in all candor, what makes us think he knocked at all? Well, he went to his house and asked for bread, so he had to have gone to the door and knocked, right? Not necessarily. You see, in all probability, what happened is that he went to that window so as not to disturb everyone in the neighborhood who were very close together, very thin walls. And he went to that window and he whispered, "Friend, wake up. Friend, I have a friend of mine that has come on a journey, and I need to borrow 3 loaves of bread." Something of trivia nature that you might be interested in is that this is the only place in the Bible that this word appears. In the Greek New Testament, this is the only place that this word is used. Now, every other ancient literary source where the word is used, though, agrees that the word means shamelessness. Shamelessness. But you know, somewhere along the road of history, a scribe thought it sounded better as persistence. And that's what became the traditional translation for the word. Probably it's due to the influence of the parable in Luke chapter 18, the parable of the persistent widow, which is another story that we'll cover a little later on in this series. But a scribe decided shamelessness doesn't sound right, so we'll make it persistence, and that's what it became. Now, the NIV translators were so unsure of how to translate this word that they used the word boldness. Boldness. Boldness kind of gives the idea of depending on character, doesn't it? But the boldness, though, would seem to be the character of the one doing the asking, because the one asking is so bold. The one on the inside gets up. But this parable, though, is about the character of the one on the inside, the one being asked, God. It's about honor. It's about character. It is about God. You know, one of the greatest things that God has done for us, if we had to put them in order and rank them according to greatness of the thing that God has done for us, number one would have to be salvation. But fairly high up on the list would have to be that God has said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened for you. God has put His power, that power that spoke and created the entire cosmos, the entire universe. That power that is displayed in quote-unquote Mother Nature and thunderstorms and other storms and so on and so forth. God has put that power at our disposal. And all we have to do is ask. And it's not because of anything that we have done that impresses God, but because of His mercy and His grace. All we have to do is ask, and it will be given to us. Seek and we will find. Knock and the door will be opened for us. Not because of us, not because of who we are, but because of God and because of His character and because of His honor and because He's told us it is so. Charlie and Ruth spent most of their life on a farm. They had lived there for many years, and one day Charlie, who was in his mid-50s, was doing some work out in his shop, and beside him he had a pan of gasoline. He was cleaning some things, which isn't necessarily a good idea, they tell us now, but in this particular time it was accepted. However, the reason they tell us not to do that today is because something ignited that pan of gasoline, and Charlie was severely burned over his entire body, his leg, his arm, his torso. He was burned badly. Ruth happened to be up at the church building when the accident occurred, and when she got a phone call, she rushed home to see what was going on, and she got there just as they were loading Charlie into the ambulance. And he looked up at her and he just said in a very weak voice, "This is bad." And he lost consciousness. Well, weeks that followed were very touch and go. He'd be up 1 minute, down the next, up 1 minute, down the next. Ruth was praying for him. The church they attended was praying for him. Charlie was slowly but surely making some steady improvement. Finally, he was well enough to be transported to a nearby larger hospital where they could begin skin graft operations to see what they could do to figure out, to make him more presentable, I guess. But each of these skin graft operations continued to make him weaker and weaker and weaker, and took him closer and closer and closer to death. During the 11th one, his heart actually stopped beating, and only the heroic measures of the doctors and nurses saved his life. When the doctor came out to talk to Ruth after that surgery, the doctor was very open and very candid with her and said, "That's it. He can't take any more. We're not going to do any more skin graft operations. That's all he can handle." In the weeks that followed, Charlie lingered between life and death. Most of the time he was semi-conscious due to the pain medication and so forth, and the doctor said that was actually a pretty good thing. One night, as she was about to leave, Ruth began to recite the 23rd Psalm, the shepherd's prayer, the shepherd's psalm. And as she was doing so, Charlie seemed to wake up and say the 23rd Psalm with her. And she thought that was strange, but, She said, well, maybe it's the pain meds, who knows? She left for the night, and when she came back the next morning, Charlie was awake and alert, which was completely foreign. I mean, that hadn't been going on, okay? He was never awake, he was never alert, he was always in that semi-conscious state. But when she got there, he said to her, I prayed last night that God would give me 20 more years, and I believe that He's going to do it. Shortly after that, the orderly came in with his breakfast tray that had never been eating, but they brought it anyway. He ate breakfast for the first time. And as Ruth watched, somewhat shocked, Charlie said, hey, I've got to get my strength back. I'm going to live for 20 more years. And Ruth was very thrilled at his optimism. She had talked to the doctor. The doctor had not given her much hope. But in the months that followed, Charlie slowly improved, steadily improved. He was able to do physical therapy, which helped him learn how to walk again, first with a walker, then with a cane. And after 10 months in the hospital, Charlie was able to go home. A little while later, he was even able to walk without a cane, though it was still with a limp. The years passed, and they were happy as ever. Then cancer struck Charlie. Surgery was done, but to no avail, and cancer took Charlie's life. In the weeks after the funeral, Ruth was looking back through some old papers and things that, like you normally do, and she found the hospital records from when Charlie had been burned so badly. Charlie had died 20 years to the day from when he had made his announcement about his prayer that God would give him 20 more years. There's tremendous power in our prayers. And it's not because of anything that we have done or we can impress God with. Prayer has powerful potential because prayer interacts with God and allows us to come into the contact with all the power of God. In fact, prayer is so powerful that, as we looked at last week, sometimes we can even change God's mind with our prayers. God has committed Himself to do so much more for us when we pray than when we do not pray. And prayer has powerful potential because prayer has to do with the character of God. For God not to listen and not to respond would be a disgrace. For God is a wonderful and gracious Father who has said, ask, and it will be given to you. We can pray with confidence of prayer's powerful potential, but we must pray. We must pray. I'm going to take a very informal survey, and I don't want you to respond visually in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But I want to ask you, how many of you, and again, no hands, how many of you pray daily for your marriage? How many of you pray daily for your children? How many of you pray daily for your parents? How many of you pray daily for the people that you have contact with on a daily basis who are not Christians? How many of you pray daily for your extended family and for those on our prayer list? I want to make a challenge to each one of you this morning. I challenge you to pray each day for the next week. Pray each and every day for each one of our three shepherds by name. Art, Mickey, and Dink, by the way, just for your reference there. I want to challenge you each and every day this next week to pray for each of our deacons by name. I want to challenge you to pray each day this week for me by name, Carl. Okay? I want to challenge you to pray each and every day for each of our Bible class teachers. And I want to just see if it makes a difference. Because I have a feeling that it will make a difference. And that feeling is because God has promised us that if we ask, we will be given. It'll be given to us. If we seek, we will find. If we knock, the door will be opened. Are you praying? There's so much that we miss out on when we fail to pray. In Acts chapter 24, verse 25, there's a man named Felix that we're introduced to. Paul is on trial. Felix liked to listen to Paul, though, liked to hear Paul when he discoursed about righteousness and things of that nature. But he always didn't want to take that final step. And so he told Paul on one occasion, go away for now, and when I find it more convenient, I'll send for you. He almost could have become a Christian, except for the fact that he wouldn't follow through with that last little bit. Almost persuaded. Almost but lost. Don't almost be persuaded of your relationship with Jesus. If you know your relationship with Jesus isn't right, make it right this morning. If we can help you to do that through a public response, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing?